He got bullied at work, but no one knew his parents owned the company. Welcome back to my channel, lovely viewers. Get ready for a wild ride because today's story is about betrayal, secrets, and sweet revenge. He was bullied at work, but little did anyone know that the quiet new guy was actually the son of the company's owners. As his tormentors pushed him to the breaking point, they had no idea who they were really messing with. You're in for a juicy tale of power shifts, hidden identities, and the ultimate payback. The morning sunlight slipped through the narrow gap in Alex's curtains, casting a soft glow on the room. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to muster the energy to get out of bed. It was his first day at the company, his parents' company to be precise, and despite how monumental it should have felt, all he could focus on was the tight knot of irritation building in his chest. Alex's phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. He glanced over at it, knowing without looking that it was his mom. She'd already called twice this morning to remind him to make a good first impression. Her voice was still echoing in his mind, her words rehearsed from weeks of insistence that this was the path he needed to follow. It wasn't that he didn't respect what his parents had built. Their waste management business was one of the largest in the region. But it wasn't what he had envisioned for his life. He had his own ideas, dreams that didn't involve dumpsters and recycling plants. "Here we go," Alex muttered to himself, throwing back the covers and sitting up. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. He shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face in an attempt to wake up fully. The water helped, but it didn't wash away the lingering frustration of being pushed into something he wasn't passionate about. His reflection stared back at him, his dark hair still tousled from sleep, and his eyes a little bloodshot from staying up late, replaying the conversation he'd had with his dad about responsibility and legacy. There was no getting out of this. By the time Alex got downstairs, the house was empty. His parents had already left early, heading to the office to manage things before his arrival. On the kitchen counter sat a bowl of cereal and a note from his mom. "Eat something before you leave. Good luck today. We know you'll do great." Alex shook his head, crumpling the note in his fist. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the gesture, but the constant reminders grated on his nerves. He wasn't a child anymore, and their unwavering expectations weighed on him heavily. After hastily eating a bowl of cereal, Alex grabbed his bag and keys, then headed out the door. The drive to the company felt surreal. It wasn't his first time visiting the office, but this time was different. He wasn't coming as the son of the owners. He was coming in as just another new hire. His parents had made it clear that no one was to know who he really was. It was part of the deal, learning the business from the ground up. While he understood the reasoning behind it, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the secret pressing down on him. As Alex pulled into the parking lot, he saw the massive building looming ahead. Trucks were lined up outside, ready for their daily routes, and workers moved about, gearing up for the long day ahead. Alex found a parking spot at the back, away from the main entrance. He wasn't ready to walk through those doors and face the day just yet. Sitting in the car for a moment, he took a deep breath and adjusted his tie. It felt stiff around his neck, like a noose slowly tightening. Finally, he stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his feet breaking the silence. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the distant hum of machines. As he walked toward the entrance, he could already feel eyes on him, the new guy. He passed by a few workers in overalls who barely glanced his way, too busy with their routines to notice him much. But the real challenge was yet to come. The office itself was a strange mix of polished corporate and gritty industrial. The walls were lined with motivational posters about teamwork and efficiency, though the faint smell of grease from the trucks outside clung to the air. Alex made his way to the small office where he'd be working for the day, operations. His dad had insisted this was where he'd learn the real heart of the business. The room was cluttered with stacks of papers, radios crackling with reports from the field, and phones ringing non-stop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the nerve center of the operation. And sitting at the desk in the corner barking orders into the phone, was Ron. Ron was a large man, easily in his mid-40s, with a permanent scowl etched into his face. His balding head gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his thick arms were crossed as he gave instructions to someone on the other end of the line. Alex had met him once, briefly, during a family event. Ron had been polite back then, but the look he shot Alex now was far from welcoming. "You the new guy?" Ron asked, his voice a low growl. Alex nodded. "Yeah, I'm Alex." Ron eyed him up and down, his lips curling slightly. "Figures. You look like you've never done a day of real work in your life. Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty." Alex bit back the retort that threatened to slip out. "I'm ready to do whatever needs to be done." "We'll see about that," Ron muttered, turning back to his desk. Alex took a seat at a small, empty desk by the window. The room was small, cramped even, but there was a certain hum of activity that kept it alive. Papers rustled, people moved in and out with purpose, and Alex could already tell that this was going to be a far cry from the clean-cut corporate environments his friends were stepping into. A few hours into the morning, Alex was handed his first task. Something simple, really, sorting through inventory lists. Nothing glamorous, but it gave him a chance to understand the company's structure. Ron didn't pay him much attention, but every now and then Alex could feel his eyes on him, watching, judging. As the day dragged on, Alex noticed more of the workers coming in from the trucks, tired, covered in grime, and clearly not in the mood for any small talk. The job wasn't pretty, and it wasn't easy. They didn't have time for niceties. The tension in the room thickened as the hours passed, and by midday, Alex found himself wishing for a break. But there was no sign of stopping. At lunch, he sat alone at a small table in the break room. The air was filled with the low hum of conversations, the clatter of trays and plates. He felt out of place here, the new guy, the outsider. But it wasn't just that. There was a growing unease in the room. He could see it in the way people looked at him. He wasn't sure if it was suspicion or something else, but either way, he felt it. Ron walked into the break room and grabbed a coffee from the machine, his eyes never leaving Alex. He smirked as he took a seat with some of the other senior employees. The conversation was low, but Alex could feel their glances in his direction. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the isolation was already starting to get to him. By the end of the day, Alex was exhausted, his shirt damp with sweat from running around trying to meet everyone's demands. Ron had given him extra tasks, seemingly as a test, and the other employees weren't exactly helpful. Every time Alex asked for assistance, he was met with either silence or vague instructions. It was clear they didn't care for the new guy, and Ron was at the center of it all. As Alex left the office that evening, the knot in his chest was tighter than ever. This wasn't just about doing the work. There was something more going on here, something that went beyond the usual hazing of a new employee. He could sense it in the way Ron acted, in the way the others followed his lead. He climbed into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't know how long he could keep this up, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just going to be another job. There was something else waiting for him here, something deeper, something darker. And whatever it was, it had only just begun. The next morning, Alex woke up to the irritating sound of his alarm blaring at full volume. He slapped it off with more force than necessary, squinting at the red numbers glowing on the clock. 6:30. He hadn't slept well the night before, tossing and turning as thoughts of Ron and the previous day replayed in his mind. His muscles still ached from all the running around he did. The knot of tension that had started forming in his chest yesterday hadn't loosened. If anything, it had grown tighter. He shuffled downstairs, his feet dragging across the hardwood floors, and once again found the kitchen empty. His parents were already gone, not surprising. They had their routines, always out the door before 7. It gave them more time to micromanage the company they were so proud of. There was another note on the counter, this time from his dad. "Make sure to check in with Ron first thing. He'll have something lined up for you." Alex groaned. Of course, it had to be Ron, the guy who seemed to take an unnatural pleasure in making Alex's first day a living hell. He was already dreading what fresh tasks Ron had cooked up for him today. Maybe cleaning out the garbage trucks or scrubbing the floors in the recycling center, just to prove a point. The worst part was, Ron didn't even know who Alex really was, or at least Alex hoped he didn't. That was the whole point of this ground-up approach his parents insisted on. No special treatment, no cutting corners, learn everything from scratch, and then when the time came, take over. But right now, Alex couldn't think that far ahead. All he wanted to do was survive the day. He grabbed a quick breakfast, just toast and coffee, nothing too heavy, and headed out the door. The weather was cooler today, a light breeze rustling the trees as he made his way to the car. The sky was overcast, threatening rain later, which was just what he needed to make things even more miserable. As he pulled into the parking lot at work, Alex noticed a few of the regulars hanging around by the trucks, smoking or chatting in low voices. He recognized some of them from yesterday, but none of them made an effort to acknowledge him as he walked past. The outsider status was already firmly cemented, and he was beginning to accept that, at least for now. When Alex entered the building, the familiar hum of activity hit him again, phones ringing, radios crackling, the murmur of voices in and out of the office. He wasn't sure why, but the place always had this underlying buzz of tension. It wasn't just the stress of managing the daily operations. There was something else. Maybe it was Ron's influence, or maybe the whole place just thrived on a certain level of hostility. As soon as he stepped into the operations office, he spotted Ron leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching him with that same smug smirk from yesterday. It was as if Ron had been waiting for him, eager to continue whatever twisted game he had started. "Morning, new guy," Ron said without getting up. "Ready for another fun-filled day?" Alex clenched his jaw but forced a nod. "What do you need me to do?" Ron raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Alex's attempts to keep things civil. "We're a little short-staffed today. Got a couple of people out sick. You'll be picking up the slack." Alex was about to ask what that meant exactly when Ron's phone buzzed. He picked it up, glancing at the screen, then set it down with a chuckle. "Looks like we've got someone new joining the team today," Ron said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Jamie's the name. Fresh meat, just like you. Hope you don't mind a little company." Alex barely reacted to the news. Jamie? That sounded like a guy's name. Great, he thought. Another new hire for Ron to push around. Maybe with Jamie around, Ron would shift some of his attention elsewhere and give Alex a bit of breathing room. Ron stood up, grabbing his clipboard, and motioned for Alex to follow him. "Come on, let's go introduce you to your new buddy." Alex trailed behind, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He hoped Jamie wasn't another snitch or kiss-up to Ron, someone who'd just pile on more work and make his life harder. If he had any luck today, maybe Jamie would turn out to be decent, someone who didn't care about the weird pecking order Ron had going on in this place. They headed to the truck yard, where the new hires usually met before being given their assignments. A few employees were milling about, checking equipment or chatting idly. Alex scanned the crowd, looking for any sign of Jamie. There was a group of men by the trucks, but none of them seemed to stand out as particularly new. Maybe this Jamie guy was late. As they approached, Ron nudged Alex with his elbow. "There he is. New kids over there." Alex glanced in the direction Ron was pointing, but didn't see anyone. "Where?" Ron smirked, clearly enjoying Alex's confusion. "Right there, by the office door." Alex's eyes landed on a slender figure standing near the entrance, half hidden behind one of the larger trucks. His initial thought was that it was someone lost, maybe someone from the office staff who had wandered into the wrong area. But as they got closer, Alex's stomach dropped. That wasn't some guy, that was Jamie. She had her back to them at first, her long brunette hair pulled into a ponytail, her frame petite but strong-looking. When she turned around, Alex felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Jamie wasn't just any new hire. She was gorgeous, with striking eyes that seemed to reflect the uncertainty of her first day, but also an undeniable warmth. She looked overwhelmed, like someone who'd wandered into the wrong place but was trying to hold it together. Alex blinked, trying to process this. Jamie was definitely not what he had expected. He had pictured some lanky dude with a bad attitude, someone Ron would have no problem bullying. But this girl, she seemed different. Before Alex could say anything, Ron stepped forward, grinning as if he were enjoying some private joke. "Jamie, this is Alex. He's new here too, so you two should get along just fine." Jamie smiled nervously, her gaze darting between Alex and Ron. "Hi, nice to meet you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the trucks. Alex nodded, still a little stunned. "Yeah, nice to meet you too." Ron clapped his hands together, clearly eager to get things rolling. "All right, you two. You'll be working together today. We've got a lot to get through, so don't slack off." He turned to leave, but not before shooting Alex a knowing look. "Keep an eye on her, Alex. Wouldn't want her to get overwhelmed on her first day." Alex felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He watched as Ron sauntered off, leaving him alone with Jamie. The tension in the air was thick, and Alex could sense that Jamie was just as nervous as he was. "So," Alex started, trying to break the awkward silence. "First day, huh?" Jamie nodded, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "Yeah, I'm not really sure what to expect." Alex couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Neither am I, honestly. This place is something." She smiled faintly, and for a moment, the unease between them seemed to dissipate. There was something about her presence that made Alex feel oddly protective, like he wanted to shield her from whatever Ron had in store. He barely knew her, but there was a softness to her that reminded him of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The noise of the trucks rumbled in the background, and Alex found himself glancing at Jamie more than he intended. She was shorter than him by a few inches, slim but not frail, with delicate features that contrasted with the roughness of the job. "I guess we should get started," Alex said finally, motioning toward the yard. "Ron's not exactly known for his patience." Jamie laughed nervously. "Yeah, I noticed that." As they headed toward their first task of the day, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be different. Jamie's arrival had thrown him off balance, but in a strange way, he was glad she was here. Maybe having someone else in the same boat as him would make the days a little more bearable. But as they walked side by side, Alex couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before Ron set his sights on her, and more importantly, how far he would go to make sure neither of them had an easy ride. The next few days at the office were a blur of routine tasks and uncomfortable interactions. Alex's first day had made it clear that he wasn't going to have an easy ride, but he had braced himself for the long haul. The office felt like a minefield, each step carefully calculated to avoid more encounters with Ron. But despite the tension, Alex tried to remain composed, keeping his head down and focusing on his work. The biggest surprise in the days that followed was Jamie. She had been assigned a cubicle just a few rows away from Alex's, and although they hadn't exchanged more than a few polite greetings in passing, he found his thoughts wandering back to her more than he expected. Initially, he hadn't thought much of her. It wasn't that Jamie lacked anything in terms of appearance, quite the opposite, actually. When Alex first laid eyes on her, he was struck by how effortlessly beautiful she was, with her dark, glossy hair that framed her face just right and those wide, curious eyes. There was something innocent about her presence, something soft and unassuming. It wasn't what he'd expected when he heard someone mention her name for the first time. Jamie. He had pictured some cocky, athletic guy who'd fit right into Ron's crowd. The name didn't scream gorgeous brunette with kind eyes to him, and that misjudgment only deepened his curiosity about her. Ron hadn't been kind to her either. Alex had caught a few snide comments thrown her way. Nothing as overt as what Alex had experienced, but still, it was enough to make Jamie retreat into herself whenever Ron or his lackeys were around. He could see the tension in her body whenever she had to speak to them, the way her shoulders tensed, her eyes darting around like she was searching for an exit. It was familiar, too familiar. Alex hated it. One rainy afternoon, Alex noticed Jamie struggling with a stack of files at the far end of the office. Ron was at his desk nearby, feet kicked up, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that made Alex's blood boil. It was clear Jamie had been given extra work, probably a task that wasn't hers to handle, and now she was juggling it all under the pressure of finishing it before the day ended. Alex hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He had every intention of minding his own business, keeping his head down like he always did. But something about the way Jamie winced every time she shifted the weight of the files in her arms made him want to stand up and do something. She didn't deserve to be treated like that, especially by people who saw themselves as superior. His chair creaked as he pushed back from his desk. Without thinking too much about it, he stood up, walked over to her, and gently took the top half of the stack from her hands. Jamie blinked, surprised by the sudden help, and for a moment they just stood there in silence. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words seemed to get stuck. "Here," Alex said softly, giving her a reassuring smile. "Let me help you with these. You shouldn't have to do it all by yourself." For a second, she looked like she might refuse his help. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just the fear of Ron seeing someone assist her. But then she sighed, her shoulders relaxing a little, and nodded. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Together, they carried the files to her desk. Alex noticed that Jamie had a few knickknacks on her desk, simple things like a photo of what looked like her parents, a small plant, and a mug that read, "Coffee first, adulting later." It was a contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of the rest of the office, and Alex couldn't help but find it endearing. Once the files were settled, Jamie offered him a shy smile, the kind that almost made him forget about the constant tension in the office. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice soft but grateful. "Well, someone has to, right?" Alex replied, trying to keep things light. "Besides, we newbies have to stick together." Jamie's smile faltered for a second, her eyes darting over to where Ron sat. He was on the phone, completely oblivious to what had just happened. She chewed on her lip for a moment, hesitating before she spoke again. "It's not just that," she said quietly, glancing around as if making sure no one else could overhear. "They've been giving me a hard time lately." Alex wasn't surprised. He'd seen the little things, Ron's dismissive tone, the way his friends would laugh at her expense when she walked by. It was all too familiar, and suddenly he felt an overwhelming sense of protectiveness towards her. "I've noticed," Alex admitted, keeping his voice low to match hers. "It's not right. They shouldn't be treating you like that." Jamie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Why don't you say anything?" she asked softly. "I mean, I've seen how they treat you too. You never fight back." Her question caught Alex off guard. He had never really thought about it in those terms. For him, it was a matter of survival, keeping his head down, blending in, not drawing too much attention to himself. After all, if he wanted to learn the ins and outs of the business, he couldn't afford to make waves. But Jamie's question lingered in his mind, like a splinter that wouldn't go away. Why didn't he fight back? Why didn't he stand up for himself, or for her, for that matter? He cleared his throat, unsure of how to answer without revealing too much. "I guess I just don't think it's worth it. Ron's the type of guy who enjoys pushing people around. If you fight back, it only gives him more power, you know?" Jamie nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. There was something in her eyes, something that made Alex think she wasn't used to staying quiet. Maybe she had learned to survive in this environment, just like him, but there was still a spark there, a quiet defiance that he admired. "Well, thank you for helping me today," Jamie said, breaking the silence between them. "I really appreciate it." Alex smiled, trying to brush off the tension that had built up in the conversation. "Anytime." They stood there for a moment longer, neither of them sure what to say next. It was a strange feeling, this unspoken connection between them. They were both outsiders in their own way, both trying to navigate a hostile work environment without drawing too much attention to themselves. As the day wore on, Alex found himself thinking about Jamie more than he expected. She was different from the others. There was a quiet strength in her that he hadn't noticed before, and now that he had, he couldn't stop thinking about it. When the clock finally hit 5, Alex gathered his things and prepared to leave. Jamie was still at her desk, tidying up the files they had carried earlier. He gave her a small wave as he passed by, and she smiled back, a genuine warmth in her expression that made him feel lighter. As Alex stepped outside into the cool evening air, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. Jamie had stirred something in him, something that made him question why he had been so willing to let Ron and the others walk all over him. Maybe it was time to start pushing back. The next morning, Alex arrived at the office with a strange feeling twisting in his gut. His usual routine of blending into the background was starting to feel uncomfortable. After his conversation with Jamie the previous day, something had shifted inside him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew one thing for sure. He was tired of being treated like a punching bag. Walking through the office doors, he felt the familiar tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a cold, sterile glow over the cubicles. He passed Ron's desk, keeping his head down, but he could feel Ron's eyes on him. It was the same every morning. Ron would find some petty way to make Alex's day harder, whether it was a snide comment or dumping extra work on him at the last minute. But today, Alex was already on edge, his patience thinner than usual. He sat down at his desk and powered up his computer, trying to focus on the tasks ahead. His hands moved automatically over the keyboard, but his mind kept drifting back to Jamie. He had noticed her walking in earlier, looking as worn out as he felt. Something about the way she moved, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing herself for impact, bothered him. He knew what it felt like, to carry that weight of anxiety, constantly waiting for the next jab, the next cruel comment. And then, as if on cue, Ron's voice cut through the low hum of the office. "Alex!" he called out, his voice sharp and mocking. "Got a second?" Alex looked up, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer right away, but Ron didn't need a response. He was already walking over, a smug grin plastered on his face. He slapped a stack of files onto Alex's desk, the papers scattering slightly from the force. "I need these done by lunch," Ron said, not even bothering to hide the glee in his voice. "Got a meeting later, so I'll be busy. But I'm sure you don't mind, right?" Alex stared at the files, the familiar wave of frustration bubbling up inside him. He clenched his teeth, holding back the urge to say something that would only make things worse. He glanced over at Jamie's desk, catching her eye for a split second. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but she quickly turned back to her screen, her fingers tapping nervously on her keyboard. "Fine," Alex muttered, his voice low but steady. He wasn't going to give Ron the satisfaction of a reaction. Not yet, at least. Ron chuckled, clearly pleased with himself, and walked back to his desk. Alex watched him go, his fists clenched under the desk. This had been going on for weeks now. Ron's constant undermining, the piling on of extra tasks, threats about what would happen if Alex didn't pull his weight. It was all so tiresome, and yet Alex knew why he hadn't pushed back. He couldn't risk revealing who he really was. Not yet. The last thing he wanted was to be treated differently because of his last name. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered how much longer he could take it. As the morning dragged on, Alex worked his way through the files, his focus shifting between the paperwork and the growing tension between him and Ron. Every time Ron walked by, he made a point of glancing at the clock on the wall, reminding Alex that lunch was approaching and the files had better be done. Alex's mind, however, was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Jamie. The way Ron treated her gnawed at him, more than he expected. He'd seen how Ron would take every opportunity to make snide remarks, often louder than necessary so the rest of the office could hear. The day before, when Ron had made that cruel joke about her name, Alex had almost lost it. What kind of name is Jamie anyway? Were your parents idiots or something? The words had been dripping with malice, delivered in that arrogant tone Ron reserved for people he thought were beneath him. Alex had wanted to punch him right then and there, but instead, he had told him to back off, a rare moment of defiance that had startled even him. Since then, Ron had been relentless, finding new ways to push Alex's buttons. Around noon, just as Alex was wrapping up the last file, Ron sauntered over again, leaning against the edge of Alex's desk with that same cocky grin. "Done yet?" Ron asked, tapping his fingers on the desk in a slow, rhythmic pattern. "Almost," Alex replied through gritted teeth, not bothering to look up. "Better hurry," Ron sneered. "Wouldn't want you to fall behind, would we?" Before Alex could respond, Ron's attention shifted to Jamie, who was walking past with a stack of her own files. He didn't even try to lower his voice. "Hey, Jamie," Ron called out, loud enough for the entire office to hear. "Got any more manly jobs to do today? Or are you finally learning how to do the ones you've got?" Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Jamie's face turned a deep shade of red, and she paused for a moment, clearly embarrassed but not saying a word. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the floor. That was it. Alex couldn't take it anymore. "Why don't you cut it out, Ron?" Alex said, his voice cold and firm. Ron looked at him, clearly surprised by the outburst. "Excuse me," he said, feigning ignorance. "I'm just having a little fun." "Yeah, well, no one else is laughing," Alex shot back, standing up from his desk. His hands were shaking, but he didn't care. Just leave her alone. The office went silent. Everyone's eyes were on Alex now, watching the confrontation unfold. Ron's smirk faded slightly, replaced with a look of mild irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Alex. "You really want to get involved in this?" Ron asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're barely hanging on yourself and now you want to play hero for the new girl?" Alex didn't flinch. "I'm serious. Back off." For a moment, it looked like Ron might escalate things. His fists clenched at his sides, and his eyes narrowed as he sized Alex up. But then, as if deciding it wasn't worth the effort, he scoffed and stepped back. "Whatever, man," Ron muttered, turning on his heel and walking away. "Not worth my time." Alex let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The office buzzed back to life, people quietly whispering to each other, clearly intrigued by the sudden showdown. Alex sat back down, his heart still racing. He glanced over at Jamie's desk, but she wasn't there. For the rest of the day, Alex couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation. It felt good to finally stand up for himself, or rather, for Jamie. But at the same time, he knew it would only make things worse. Ron wasn't the type to let something like that slide. As the clock hit 5 and people started filing out of the office, Alex gathered his things and headed for the elevator. Just as the doors were about to close, Jamie slipped inside, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, looking up at him. "But thank you." Alex smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I couldn't just stand there and let him keep treating you like that." Jamie nodded, but there was a shadow of worry on her face. "He's going to come after you now. You know that, right?" Alex shrugged. "Let him. I'm tired of letting him walk all over everyone." They stood in silence for the rest of the elevator ride, the weight of what had happened hanging between them. When the doors finally opened, they stepped out into the parking lot, the cool evening air hitting their faces. As they parted ways, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had made his stand, but what would come next was still uncertain. The next morning felt different for Alex, and not in a good way. There was a weight pressing down on him, a tension in the pit of his stomach that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something bad is going to happen, but you have no way of predicting when or where. As he got ready for work, his movements were sluggish, his mind already anticipating the day ahead. He'd confronted Ron, and now there would be consequences. There was no way Ron was just going to let it go. He skipped breakfast, not really in the mood to eat, and grabbed a coffee to go. As he made his way into the office, the familiar sounds of ringing phones and clacking keyboards greeted him, but something felt off. It was quieter, as if people were waiting for something. He noticed a few glances thrown his way, whispers shared behind hands as he walked to his desk. It didn't take long for him to realize that the word about his confrontation with Ron had spread. "Morning," Jamie greeted him as he passed her desk. Her voice was soft, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. "Hey," Alex replied, forcing a small smile. He appreciated her concern, but he didn't want her to worry about him. If anything, she had enough to deal with already. "You okay?" she asked, lowering her voice as if to keep their conversation private. "After yesterday. I mean, you know how Ron is." Alex glanced around the office, making sure no one was listening before he leaned in slightly. "I'm fine, just not looking forward to what's coming." Jamie bit her lip, clearly wanting to say more but unsure if she should. "Just be careful, okay? He's not going to let this go easily." Alex gave her a nod, appreciating her caution, but the truth was, he didn't need the warning. He already knew exactly what kind of man Ron was. He had seen it in his eyes, the way he relished in pushing people down, controlling them with his words and actions. Ron was used to being feared, and he wasn't going to take kindly to someone standing up to him, especially someone like Alex, who Ron saw as nothing more than an insignificant newbie. As the day wore on, Alex found himself constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He could feel Ron's presence, even when the man wasn't directly in his line of sight. It was as if Ron was watching him, biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alex did his best to focus on his work, but it was hard when every muscle in his body was tense, bracing for impact. It wasn't until lunch that Ron finally made his move. Alex was sitting in the break room, nursing a half-empty coffee, when Ron strolled in with that familiar swagger, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Alex. A smirk curled on his lips, and Alex knew instantly that something was about to go down. "Hey, Alex," Ron said casually, though his voice was thick with malice. "Got a second?" Alex set his coffee down and looked up at Ron. "What do you want?" Ron chuckled, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, about how you decided to stick your nose where it didn't belong." "Yeah?" Alex's voice was calm, though his heart was racing. And, Ron continued, his tone turning darker, "I realized something. You're a nobody here. You think standing up for little Jamie is going to win you some kind of respect? Think again." Alex felt his pulse quicken. The way Ron spoke about Jamie made his blood boil, but he didn't let it show. He had to keep his cool. "Leave her out of this," Alex said, his voice steady but firm. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it's much bigger than that now," Ron replied, stepping closer. His smile twisted into something menacing. "See, I've been here a long time. I know how things work around here, and I know how to make someone disappear if they don't fall in line." Ron wasn't just talking about bullying anymore. He was threatening his job, but he didn't even know about his true identity. Alex tried to hide his amusement. "You're saying you're going to try to get me fired?" Alex asked, keeping his voice low so no one else in the break room would hear. He tried his best to feign concern, so Ron wouldn't suspect anything. Ron shrugged, as if the idea was no big deal. "I'm saying I've got connections, people who listen to me. You screw with me, and you'll be out of here faster than you can blink." For a moment, Alex was silent, weighing his options. He could push back, escalate things, or he could back down and try to avoid the fallout. But as he looked at Ron, he knew there was only one way this was going to go. He wasn't going to let Ron win, not like this. "Do whatever you want, Ron," Alex said, his voice cool but resolute. "I'm not afraid of you." Ron's eyes narrowed, the smirk fading from his face. He hadn't expected that response. "You think you're tough, huh?" Ron sneered. "We'll see how tough you are when management's breathing down your neck." With that, Ron turned and stormed out of the break room, leaving Alex sitting there, his heart pounding. He had just declared war, and he knew it. But what choice did he have? He couldn't keep letting Ron push him around, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let Ron hurt Jamie any more than he already had. The rest of the day was a blur. Alex could feel the tension mounting, the whispers growing louder. He knew people were talking about him, about the way he had stood up to Ron, about what might happen next. Jamie was quiet, staying close but not saying much. It was like she knew the storm was coming, but she didn't know how to stop it. By the time the day ended, Alex was exhausted. He hadn't even realized how much the day had worn him down until he stepped outside into the cool evening air, the weight of the office finally lifting from his shoulders. As he walked toward his car, he noticed Jamie standing near the parking lot, waiting for him. "Hey," she said quietly when he approached. "Hey," he replied, offering her a small smile. "You okay?" Jamie nodded, though her eyes were filled with worry. "I heard what happened. Ron's not going to let this go, Alex. He's going to come after you." "I know," Alex said, his voice calm, "but I'm not backing down." Jamie looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Alex hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, he was tired of feeling powerless, tired of being pushed around. But more than that, he cared about Jamie, more than he probably should. "Because someone has to stand up to him," Alex finally said, his voice soft. "And because I care about you, Jamie. I can't just stand by and let him treat you like that." Jamie blinked, clearly taken aback by his words. For a moment, she was silent, her cheeks turning a soft shade of pink. "You care about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, feeling his heart race in his chest. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but now that the words were out there, he couldn't take them back. Jamie looked down at her feet, her hair falling in front of her face as she processed his words. I care about you too, Alex, but this is dangerous. If Ron finds out, if anyone finds out, things could get worse for both of us." "I know," Alex said quietly, "but I'm willing to take that risk." Jamie looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty and something else, something he couldn't quite place. She stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "Alex, I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Alex reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm not doing this just for you, Jamie. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the world around them fading into the background. Alex could feel the warmth of her hand in his, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she held on to him. He knew they were walking a dangerous line, but he didn't care. Not anymore. "Let's just keep this between us," Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible. "At least for now." Alex nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Yeah, for now." And as they stood there in the fading light, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next few days at the office felt like walking on a tightrope for Alex. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface since his confrontation with Ron was palpable. It felt like everyone was watching, waiting for the next move, and Alex was caught in the middle of it all. Each day felt heavier than the last, like a storm building slowly on the horizon, ready to break at any moment. Despite his defiance, standing up to Ron hadn't brought the sense of relief he thought it might. Instead, it had only made things more complicated, especially now with Jamie in the picture. Their secret had become both a comfort and a source of anxiety. Every glance they shared, every word exchanged in private felt like it was on the verge of being exposed. Ron, of course, hadn't let up. If anything, his bullying had become more subtle, more calculated. Gone were the overt digs and public humiliation. Instead, Ron had taken to more insidious tactics, little things that chipped away at Alex's confidence. He'd accidentally delete important files from shared drives, misdirect Alex's emails, and sabotage minor projects that Alex was working on. He was playing a long game, biding his time, and making sure that Alex would eventually look incompetent in front of the higher-ups. "Are you sure you're okay with all of this?" Jamie asked quietly one morning, pulling Alex aside near the copy room. Her eyes were full of concern, the kind that made Alex's stomach twist. She'd been watching everything unfold, and while she was still facing her own issues with the office culture, she knew Alex had taken on more than he should. "I don't have much of a choice," Alex replied, trying to shrug off the weight of it all, even though the pressure was becoming harder to ignore. "Ron's not going to stop, Jamie. I just need to stay ahead of him." "But what if you can't?" Jamie's voice trembled slightly as she glanced around, making sure no one was listening. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "He's out to get you, Alex. He's not going to let this go, and I don't want to see you get hurt." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Alex had been so focused on holding his own that he hadn't considered what it might be doing to Jamie. He could see the fear in her eyes, the guilt. She felt like she was responsible for what was happening, and Alex couldn't stand the thought of that. "I can handle him," Alex said softly. His tone meant to reassure her, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "I promise." Jamie's expression didn't soften. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of weakness, any crack in the armor he was so desperately trying to hold together. "I don't want to see you fight my battles, Alex. I don't want this to get worse for you." "It's not just about you anymore," Alex admitted, feeling the weight of the confession sink into his chest. "I'm tired of people like Ron getting away with this kind of stuff. It's not right, and if I don't do something, who will?" Jamie sighed, her shoulders slumping as she leaned back against the wall. "I just wish things could go back to the way they were, before all of this." Alex didn't say anything for a moment. He understood what she meant. Things had been simpler before the bullying, before Ron's vendetta, and before their secret relationship had added another layer of tension to everything. But there was no going back now. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. Later that afternoon, as Alex sat at his desk trying to focus on his work, he felt a growing sense of unease. Something was wrong. The office felt too quiet, too still, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then, it did. A sudden flurry of activity erupted from across the office. Voices rose, and people began to gather near Ron's desk, whispering and pointing. Alex's heart sank as he watched the commotion unfold. His gut told him that whatever was happening, it wasn't good. Before he could even get up to see what was going on, his phone buzzed. It was an email. His blood ran cold. Alex's hands trembled as he opened the email. Subject: urgent, project mishap, immediate action required. It was from one of the higher-ups, a stern, no-nonsense executive named Caroline Davis. She rarely sent emails to employees unless something was seriously wrong. The email was short, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through Alex's system. "Alex, we've just been informed of a serious issue with the Anderson project. Files have been misplaced, deadlines missed, and several key pieces of information are missing. This has led to significant delays in the project's progress. We need to meet immediately to discuss the next steps. Please come to my office ASAP." Alex stared at the email, his mind racing. The Anderson project had been one of the major tasks he'd been assigned since joining the company. He had put everything into making sure it ran smoothly, double-checking every detail and working late nights to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. There was no way the files could have gone missing, not unless someone had deliberately sabotaged them. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood from his desk, his legs feeling weak beneath him. As he made his way toward Caroline's office, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The whispers followed him like a shadow, and he knew exactly what they were saying. Alex had messed up. Alex had failed, and that's exactly what Ron had wanted. When he reached Caroline's office, she was waiting for him, her expression stern and her arms crossed. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Alex," she said, her tone brisk, "can you explain what happened with the Anderson project?" Alex opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. He knew exactly what had happened. Ron had sabotaged him. He'd been playing dirty from the start, setting Alex up to fail. But how could he prove it without sounding paranoid or like he was making excuses? I've been working on the project non-stop," Alex began, trying to steady his voice. I don't know how the files could have gone missing, but I can assure you that I didn't misplace them. Caroline's eyes narrowed. This is a major issue, Alex. The Anderson project is one of our biggest clients, and any delays are going to reflect poorly on the company. We need to get this sorted out immediately. I understand, Alex said quickly, his mind racing for a solution. I'll go through everything again and see if I can recover the files. There must be some mistake. Do that, Caroline said sharply. And I expect a report by the end of the day. We can't afford any more setbacks. Alex nodded, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. As he left her office, the reality of the situation sank in. Ron had set him up, and now he was going to have to fight to clear his name. But as he made his way back to his desk, something caught his eye. Jamie, standing near the break room, her face pale and her eyes wide with worry. She'd heard what had happened, and Alex could see the fear in her expression. Without thinking, Alex walked over to her, his mind still racing. Jamie, I need your help, he said quietly, pulling her aside so no one could overhear them. Ron did this. I don't know how, but he sabotaged the project, and now I'm the one taking the fall. Jamie's eyes widened and she glanced around nervously. What are we going to do? She whispered. If Ron's behind this, he's not going to stop. He's trying to destroy you. I know, Alex said, his voice tense, but we're not going to let him win. As they stood there, a plan began to form in Alex's mind. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The weight of the Anderson project hung over Alex like a dark cloud. Every step he took back to his desk felt heavier, the distance longer. His mind raced with thoughts of how Ron had managed to sabotage him so flawlessly without leaving any obvious traces. It wasn't just about proving his competence anymore, it was about survival. He couldn't let Ron win. As Alex sat down, his eyes darted to the office around him. Everyone was in their usual places, their faces glued to their screens or pretending not to notice what was happening. But Alex knew better. The gossip had already started to circulate, whispers moving through the office like wildfire. They were watching him, waiting for him to crash and burn. Jamie approached, cautiously. She moved like a shadow, slipping into the seat beside him at his desk. Her expression was tight with concern, but there was also a new determination in her eyes, something that mirrored what Alex was feeling. This wasn't just about him anymore. I've been thinking, Jamie started, keeping her voice low. Ron is careful, but he's also arrogant. He's going to slip up, Alex. He thinks he's untouchable, but we can catch him. Alex's jaw clenched. He knew she was right, but the challenge was figuring out how. I don't have much time, he whispered back, frustration lacing his voice. Caroline's already breathing down my neck, and if I don't fix this, I'm done. Jamie hesitated for a second, then leaned in even closer. What if I could help? You know, keep an eye on things when Ron isn't looking. He's not watching me as closely as he is you. Maybe I can find something. Alex's heart skipped a beat at her offer. He wanted to protest, to tell her she shouldn't get involved any deeper than she already was. But a part of him knew this was the best option. Ron wouldn't expect Jamie to be involved, and that might just give them the advantage they needed. You don't have to do that, Jamie, Alex said, trying to sound strong even though he was deeply conflicted. I know I don't have to, she replied, her voice soft but firm. But I want to. Ron has been treating me like garbage since day one. We have to fight back, together. There was no hesitation in her voice, and Alex could see that she wasn't afraid of the risk anymore. They had both been pushed too far, and the only way to move forward was to confront it head-on. Okay, Alex agreed, his voice barely audible. We'll do it together. The plan was simple enough in theory. Jamie would start subtly gathering information while Alex tried to stay under the radar, working on salvaging the Anderson project. But every glance Ron threw his way, every smug smirk, made Alex's blood boil. Ron thought he had already won. As the afternoon wore on, the office buzzed with its usual hum. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and conversations buzzed in hushed tones. But beneath the normalcy, Alex's tensions simmered. He decided to grab a coffee, needing a few minutes away from his desk. As he entered the break room, he noticed Ron leaning against the counter, chatting with one of the other senior workers, Chris. They both stopped when Alex walked in, their conversation dropping to a quiet murmur. Ron's eyes met Alex's, and that familiar, condescending smirk appeared on his face. "Hey, rookie," Ron sneered. "How's the Anderson project coming along? Everything on track?" Alex stiffened. He knew Ron was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction, but he wasn't going to take the bait. He grabbed his coffee and turned away, biting his tongue, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" Ron's voice followed him as Alex started to walk away. "You should really be more careful. You wouldn't want management to think you're not cut out for this job. People get fired for less, you know?" The venom in Ron's tone was unmistakable, and Alex's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles white. He forced himself to walk away, not giving Ron the satisfaction of a response. As much as he wanted to, he couldn't afford another confrontation. Not yet. Jamie caught up with him later that evening, just as the office was beginning to wind down. She had been unusually quiet all day, and Alex could tell she had been working on something. Her nervous energy was hard to miss. "I think I found something," Jamie said quietly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. Alex's heart quickened. "What is it?" Jamie hesitated for a moment, then pulled out her phone. "I overheard Ron talking to Chris earlier," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were talking about the Anderson project and how easy it was to mess with your files. He mentioned something about the server logs, and that's when it clicked for me." "The server logs?" Alex repeated, confused. "Yes," Jamie nodded. "Every time someone accesses a file, the server logs show who did it and when. If Ron tampered with your files, there'll be a record of it. We just have to check the logs." Alex felt a flicker of hope for the first time all day. If Jamie was right, they could prove that Ron had sabotaged the project. But getting access to the server logs wasn't going to be easy. Only a few people in the company had that kind of clearance. "Do you think we can get access?" Alex asked, keeping his voice low. "I know someone in IT," Jamie said, her lips curling into a small smile. "He owes me a favor." Alex's chest tightened with anticipation. This was the break they needed. If they could get the logs and prove Ron's interference, it could turn the tables completely. "Let's do it," Alex said, his voice filled with newfound determination. That night, as the office emptied out and the building grew quiet, Jamie stayed behind, heading to the IT department with a carefully rehearsed excuse. She had told Alex to wait in his office, not wanting to raise any suspicions. Time seemed to crawl as Alex waited, his nerves on edge. The minutes ticked by, and each one felt longer than the last. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jamie returned, her face flushed with excitement. She didn't say anything at first, just walked over to Alex's desk and slid her phone across to him. On the screen was a series of timestamps, each one corresponding to when the files had been accessed. "You were right," Jamie said quietly, her voice filled with relief. "Look at this. Ron accessed the Anderson project files 3 days ago, just before everything went missing." Alex stared at the screen, the evidence right in front of him. It was all there. Ron had set him up, and now they had the proof. But as Alex's mind raced with the possibilities, a new thought crept into his mind. What if Ron wasn't acting alone? The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Ron wasn't the type to orchestrate something like this on his own. He was too careless, too arrogant. Someone else had to be pulling the strings. Jamie's voice cut through his thoughts. "What do we do now?" Alex looked up at her, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. They had the evidence, but exposing Ron wouldn't be enough if there was more at play. "We wait," Alex said finally, his voice steady. "We gather more. This isn't over." As Jamie nodded, her expression determined, Alex knew they were about to step into dangerous territory. But there was no turning back now. They were in this together, and they were going to see it through to the end. And as for Ron, his days of bullying were numbered. The next few days in the office felt like a ticking time bomb. with each passing second bringing Alex and Jamie closer to a confrontation they weren't fully prepared for. The server logs were like a secret weapon, tucked away in the quiet corners of Alex's thoughts, burning a hole in his conscience. The evidence against Ron was clear, but the looming question hung in the air. What if Ron wasn't acting alone? As Alex sat at his desk, his fingers hovered above his keyboard, pretending to work while his mind was elsewhere. The usual sounds of phones ringing and keyboards clicking faded into the background, replaced by a low hum of tension in his chest. He could feel the weight of it, the uncertainty pressing down on him. Jamie, seated just a few desks away, caught his eye. She gave him a subtle nod, signaling that they were still in this together, that she hadn't wavered in her resolve. There was something unspoken between them, a connection forged in secrecy and a mutual desire to fight back against Ron and the invisible forces that seemed to control the office. Her presence, however subtle, was his anchor. But beneath the surface, Alex was struggling. He felt like he was walking a tightrope between fear and resolve, unsure of how much longer he could keep this balancing act going. The bullying had become more subtle but no less damaging. A snide comment here, an accusatory glance there. Ron's taunts were like little daggers, designed to wear him down bit by bit. And yet, the fact that Ron hadn't escalated things made Alex nervous. It felt like the calm before the storm. That morning, the air was thick with humidity, a rare heat wave rolling through the city, making everything feel sluggish and stifling. Even the office's industrial-strength air conditioning couldn't seem to chase away the sticky warmth. Alex loosened his tie, glancing at the clock on his screen. It wasn't even 11 a.m., but the day already felt like it had stretched on forever. Jamie approached his desk quietly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, standing up slowly. "Let's go to the stairwell," he suggested, his voice equally low. It had become their unofficial meeting spot, a place where they could speak without the fear of prying eyes or ears. Once they were safely tucked away behind the heavy metal door of the stairwell, Alex leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. Jamie paced in front of him, her anxiety palpable. "I can't keep pretending everything's normal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's like Ron knows something's up. He's been watching me more closely, and I swear I heard him talking to Caroline yesterday." The mention of Caroline's name sent a shiver down Alex's spine. Caroline, the sharp, no-nonsense office manager, had always struck Alex as someone who played by the rules, but only because she was the one who made them. If she was involved, this whole situation could spiral out of control even faster than he'd imagined. "I'm not surprised," Alex said, rubbing the back of his neck in frustration. "She's always had her eye on me. If Ron's pulling her into this, we're going to have to be even more careful." Jamie stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "We have to do something, Alex. We can't just sit around and wait for them to make the next move. What if they're planning something bigger?" Alex let out a heavy sigh, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, of course. They couldn't afford to be passive anymore. But the risk was huge. If they made a wrong move, if they confronted Ron too soon, it could all blow up in their faces. "I know," Alex said finally, his voice low, "but we have to be smart about this. We need more than just the server logs. We need to know if Caroline's involved and who else might be pulling the strings. If we act now, we might not have enough to bring them down." Jamie's eyes softened as she looked at him. "You've changed, you know that?" she said quietly, almost as if the words were slipping out before she could stop them. Alex raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when I first met you, you were so quiet, so detached. It was like you didn't care about anything. But now you're fighting back. You're not just letting Ron walk all over you anymore." Alex looked away, his heart thudding in his chest. He hadn't realized it, but Jamie was right. He had changed. Somewhere along the way, the fear of failure, the fear of standing up to Ron, had been replaced by something else, something stronger. It wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about survival, about protecting Jamie, protecting the life he was trying to build, even if it wasn't the one he'd chosen. "I guess I just got tired of being pushed around," Alex said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Jamie stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "I'm glad," she said softly, "because I need you, Alex. I don't know what I'd do if I had to face all of this alone." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alex swallowed hard, feeling the chemistry between them crackle like electricity. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to pull her into his arms and tell her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. Not here, not now. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're not alone," he said, his voice steady. "We're in this together." Jamie smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made Alex's heart ache in ways he hadn't expected. But before either of them could say anything more, the door to the stairwell creaked open. They both froze, their hands dropping to their sides as Ron stepped into the stairwell, a smug grin on his face. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do we have here? A little secret meeting?" Alex's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had been caught off guard, and Ron's presence was like a slap to the face. Jamie stiffened beside him, her face pale. "We were just taking a break," Alex said, his voice carefully measured. "Is there a problem, Ron?" Ron's grin widened as he stepped closer, his eyes flicking between Alex and Jamie with a look of smug satisfaction. "You two seem awfully close," he said, his voice low and menacing. "A little too close for co-workers, don't you think?" Alex clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to punch Ron in the face. He wasn't going to let Ron get to him, not again. But Jamie, standing beside him, was visibly shaking. "We're just colleagues, Ron," Alex said evenly. "Maybe you should mind your own business." Ron chuckled darkly, clearly enjoying the power he held over them in that moment. "Oh, I am minding my business," he said. "And my business is making sure things in this office run smoothly. You, Alex, are making waves, and that's a problem." Alex's heart raced as he realized that Ron wasn't just taunting them. He was issuing a threat. The tension in the stairwell was suffocating, the air thick with the unspoken challenge between them. "Is that a threat?" Alex asked, his voice dangerously calm. Ron smirked, stepping even closer, his face inches from Alex's. "It's whatever you want it to be, rookie," he whispered. "But you'd better watch your back." With that, Ron turned and walked out of the stairwell, leaving Alex and Jamie standing in stunned silence. The door closed with a heavy thud, echoing in the empty stairwell. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his mind racing. Ron was more dangerous than he'd thought, and now he knew for sure that they were being watched. Jamie looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "We fight back," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. The next morning, Alex arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to get some time to clear his head before the inevitable chaos of the day began. He hadn't been sleeping well, his thoughts consumed by the ever-tightening conflict with Ron. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. His parents had always told him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. The truth about his family loomed closer to the surface than ever before, and he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Jamie knew his feelings, but not the full weight of his family's legacy. He wasn't ready to bring her into that world just yet. He sat at his desk, opening his laptop, but before he could get to work, the door to the office creaked open, and Jamie slipped in. Her eyes, as always, were filled with quiet concern. She moved toward him quickly, her slim figure barely making a sound on the carpet. The sight of her should have brought him comfort, but today her face was set in a tense expression that told Alex something had shifted. "Alex," she whispered, leaning in close as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. "I overheard something." His pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" Jamie hesitated, biting her lip, before she finally spoke. "Ron's planning something big. He's been talking to Caroline and a few others. They're trying to frame you for something serious, Alex. I don't know all the details, but it sounds like they're going to make you take the fall for a major screw-up that hasn't even happened yet. Alex felt his chest tighten. He knew Ron would stoop low. But this? Framing him for something that hadn't even happened yet? Jamie's voice shook as she continued. I think it might be related to that big contract we're working on, the waste disposal deal with the city. Ron's been overseeing a lot of it, and I overheard him saying something about how all it takes is one mistake. Alex clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. Of course it was the city contract, the company's most lucrative deal of the year. If something went wrong, it would be disastrous, and Ron was going to make sure Alex took the fall for it. His mind raced. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. But confronting Ron head-on wasn't an option either. The man was too slippery, too cunning. And Caroline? He'd underestimated her before. Now, he had to assume she was in this as deep as Ron. Alex's jaw tightened. We need proof, he said finally, his voice low and controlled. If we can get our hands on whatever they're planning, we can stop it before it happens. Jamie nodded, but she looked worried. How do we do that? Ron's been careful. He's not leaving a paper trail. Alex thought for a moment, his mind racing. If he's messing with the city contract, there's got to be something. Emails, documents. Maybe he's planning to sabotage something in the logistics chain. We just have to find it before he pulls the trigger. Jamie glanced at her watch nervously. We don't have much time. I think they're moving soon. Alex stood up, pacing as his mind worked furiously. Okay, he said, turning to face her. I'll check the contract files, see if anything looks off. I'll keep an eye on Ron, Jamie interrupted, already knowing what needed to be done. I'll listen, see if I can catch anything else. But Alex, she added, her voice softening, be careful. If they're really setting you up, they'll do anything to cover their tracks. Alex nodded, his heart pounding. I know, but we've come too far to back down now. The day passed in a blur of tension and quiet planning. Every time Ron walked past Alex's desk, his smug grin made Alex's skin crawl. But Alex didn't let it show. He kept his head down, focusing on the files in front of him, meticulously going over every detail of the city contract. If there was a crack in Ron's plan, he was going to find it. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, Alex finally stumbled upon something. It was subtle, almost too subtle to notice. But there it was, an odd discrepancy in the waste collection schedules for a major section of the city. It didn't make sense, and it didn't line up with the rest of the contract. Alex's pulse quickened. This was it, the setup. He immediately sent a message to Jamie, telling her what he'd found. But before he could follow up, the door to the office swung open, and Ron strode in, his grin wider than usual. Hey, Alex, Ron called out, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. Busy day? Alex looked up, his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Just getting some work done, he replied casually. Ron sauntered over, leaning against Alex's desk with a smirk. Good to hear. You know, the higher-ups are really counting on you to pull through with that city contract. Big responsibility for someone so new. Alex clenched his jaw but didn't rise to the bait. I know what I'm doing, he said evenly. Ron chuckled, patting Alex's shoulder in a mock-friendly gesture. I hope so. I'd hate to see something go wrong under your watch. That'd be a real shame, wouldn't it? Alex met Ron's gaze, his heart pounding with anger, but he kept his expression neutral. I'm sure it'll be fine, he said, his voice calm. Ron's smirk widened, and for a moment, Alex wondered if he knew he was onto him. But then Ron simply straightened up, clapped Alex on the back, and strolled out of the office casually. As soon as Ron was gone, Alex exhaled a shaky breath, his mind racing. He had the proof. He knew what Ron was planning. But now, the real challenge lay ahead, how to expose it without giving Ron and Caroline the upper hand. Later that afternoon, Jamie slipped into Alex's office, her eyes wide with urgency. I've been listening all day, she said breathlessly. Ron's definitely planning to sabotage the contract. I overheard him talking to someone on the phone. He's setting you up to take the fall. Alex nodded, showing her the document he'd found. "I knew it," he said grimly. "But we still don't have enough. We need to catch him in the act." Jamie bit her lip, glancing nervously toward the door. "What do we do?" "We're going to expose him," Alex said, his voice steady. "But we need to do it carefully. If we go to management too early, Ron will cover his tracks. We have to let him think he's winning, until we can prove what he's done." Jamie nodded, though Alex could see the fear in her eyes. "We'll have to be careful," she said softly. "If he finds out we're onto him." Alex reached out, taking her hand in his. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "I promise." Jamie looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, and for a moment there was nothing but the quiet intensity between them. The connection that had been building seemed to solidify in that moment. They weren't just co-workers or secret lovers anymore, they were partners. And with that, Alex knew this was far from over. But whatever came next, they would face it together. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. After months of enduring Ron's bullying and keeping his true identity under wraps, Alex knew it was time to bring everything into the open. He and Jamie had gathered enough evidence of Ron's sabotage to confront him publicly, and Alex had no more reason to stay silent. The weight of the secret had been dragging him down, but now he was ready to reveal the truth on his terms. The morning started like any other, with Alex quietly working at his desk, keeping his head down while the office buzzed with routine. But today, something was different. Today, there was a quiet confidence in his posture, a new energy in his steps. Even Jamie, who sat across from him, seemed to sense it. She shot him a glance, her brown eyes full of unspoken questions and worry. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Jamie whispered, leaning toward him as they prepared to walk into the all-hands meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. Alex took a deep breath and gave a nod. "I have to be. This has gone on long enough." The weeks of enduring Ron's harassment had taken a toll on Alex, but he had also grown stronger through the ordeal. The evidence of Ron's lies, the manipulation, it was all there, ready to be exposed. And though Alex still wasn't sure how the others would react to the reveal of his identity, he couldn't let fear hold him back anymore. The afternoon meeting loomed large, and as Alex sat at his desk, he could hear Ron across the office, laughing loudly with some of the other employees. Ron had no idea what was coming his way. "Hey, Alex! You want to grab us some coffee before the meeting?" Ron called out with his usual smug grin, waving his empty cup in the air as though Alex were nothing more than a servant. Several others chuckled in the background, watching the scene with the same twisted amusement they had shown for months. Alex didn't respond, but Jamie shot Ron a glare, her frustration barely contained. She hated how Ron treated Alex, how the rest of the staff had gone along with it as if it were some cruel game. They all saw Alex as the new guy, the easy target. No one had any idea who he really was or what he was capable of. Jamie leaned closer to Alex. "Don't let him get to you." "I'm not," Alex replied quietly. "Not today." The meeting room was packed when Alex and Jamie walked in. Ron, still clueless, took his usual seat toward the front, smug and confident. Alex's parents were already seated at the head of the table, their expressions serious but calm. They had no idea what their son was about to reveal. This was the moment Alex had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. As the meeting began, Alex's father, Robert, spoke briefly about the company's current projects and upcoming changes. The room was filled with nods of agreement and polite murmurs, but there was a tension beneath the surface. Alex could feel it building, like a storm about to break. When Robert paused to open the floor for any pressing concerns, Alex stood up. His voice was steady as he spoke. "Actually, there's something I need to address." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Alex, surprised by his sudden interruption. Even Ron looked mildly curious, though he still wore that condescending smirk. "I've spent the last several months working here," Alex continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "And I've learned a lot about the business, about the people here, and about the way things really operate." There were a few puzzled glances exchanged, but Alex didn't stop. "But I've also seen something that shouldn't be happening. I've seen one person in particular manipulate the system, take advantage of his position, and bully others to maintain his power." The room was deathly quiet now, and Ron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his grin fading. Alex reached into his bag and pulled out the folder he and Jamie had compiled. He set it down in front of his father. "Ron has been sabotaging company operations. He's been making deliberate mistakes and blaming them on others. He's been trying to make me look like the one at fault." Ron's face turned ashen as he realized what was happening. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jamie stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. "We've got proof, Ron. You've been manipulating the roots, falsifying reports, and trying to shift the blame onto Alex. But it didn't work." Ron's eyes darted between Alex, Jamie, and the senior managers. He could feel the walls closing in, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. "Oh, so now you're playing the hero, huh?" Ron spat, standing up from his chair. "You think you can just make these wild accusations and everyone's going to believe you?" Alex took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not making accusations, Ron. I'm telling the truth, and you know it." For a moment, the room was thick with tension. Ron's gaze locked onto Alex's, and for the first time, Alex saw something he hadn't seen in months. Fear. Real, unmistakable fear. Then, as if trying to regain control, Ron sneered. "And why should anyone believe you? You're just the new guy, a nobody. Who the hell do you think you are?" Alex didn't flinch. He looked directly at Ron, then at the rest of the room. The time had come. "I'm not just the new guy," Alex said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm Alex Baines. Robert and Evelyn Baines are my parents. This company belongs to my family." The room erupted into gasps, shocked murmurs spreading like wildfire. Every eye in the room widened as the truth sank in. The quiet, bullied new guy they had underestimated for months was actually the heir to the company they all worked for. Ron's face drained of color as the realization hit him like a freight train. He stumbled back into his chair, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Robert stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on Ron with a cold fury that no one in the room had ever seen before. "You've been bullying my son?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Ron opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Robert's gaze hardened. "Get out. You're fired." For the first time, Ron looked truly terrified. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling over his words as he tried to protest, but it was too late. The senior managers were already nodding in agreement, and Robert's decision was final. As Ron stumbled out of the room, the weight of his downfall settled in the air like a heavy fog. Alex watched him go, a strange sense of relief washing over him. It was over. The truth was finally out. The room was still buzzing with shock and whispers as Alex's parents turned to him, their expressions a mixture of pride and concern. Robert stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I had no idea," Robert said quietly. "You've handled this better than I ever could have imagined." Alex nodded, though the emotions swirling inside him were still raw. "I just didn't want special treatment. I wanted to earn my place here." Evelyn smiled softly. "You already have." As the meeting came to a close, Jamie lingered by Alex's side, her eyes full of relief and admiration. "You did it," she whispered, her hand brushing against his. Alex smiled at her, a sense of peace finally settling over him. We did it. Their secret romance would remain just that, a secret. But for now, they had won. And as Alex looked around the room, he knew that this was only the beginning. He was ready for whatever came next.